Well, good morning. It's wonderful to see everyone. We're grateful for those who are joining by live stream, and we're particularly honored to have those of you who are visiting with us this morning to be here. We hope that you'll be encouraged by the things that we are able to discuss in the lesson, but also by the songs, the prayers, and simply being in the presence of the good people here at Lost River. We're really pleased that you're here. If there's anything that we can do to help you, of a spiritual nature or otherwise, we really would appreciate it if you would let us know how we can do that. It's great to be here this morning. We are in a series of lessons from the book of James, which is, many believe, the earliest or first of the New Testament books that was written. And it was written to Christians who had been under persecution and therefore dispersed from Jerusalem, where Christianity began, and had been scattered to various parts throughout the Roman Empire. And so James, whom they had a familiarity with, who was the half-brother of Jesus, writes this letter to encourage them as they are facing persecution, trials, and hardships and temptations of various sorts, to remind them of the goodness of God, and also to help them deal with the conflicts and struggles that they were dealing with, not only from the outside, but sometimes from within. And we're going to see that a lot in the book of James, that these people under pressure perhaps were not treating each other, these early Christians not treating each other maybe as well as they could have. And so James has some wisdom to share with them, some wisdom to give them that will help them to live at peace with each other. And what's really great about that is that what James reveals, what God reveals to James and through James to us, is as applicable today as it ever was. Because we all still struggle to communicate with one another well, to treat each other in a way that builds each other up instead of tearing each other down and tearing one another apart. And so I'm really excited this morning to get back into the book of James and look to this morning at just a couple of verses. We're going to be looking at verses 19 and 20. But I want to say that as a whole, as we get into this, that James is doing an overarching thing throughout the book, and that is contrasting two kinds of wisdom, two approaches to the skill of how you live your life. And those two kinds of wisdom have two different points of origin, two different sources. One of them is a wisdom that emerges from below. I want you to just kind of get that image in your mind, a wisdom that emerges from below. And it's a wisdom that when he comes to chapter 3, he's going to describe as earthly, sensual, and demonic. It's a way of looking at life and human relations that is not coming from a good place. And it's extraordinarily common. And I will almost guarantee you that there is some aspect of this wisdom from below that is operating in your life and in my life. And James wants to help them and us move off of that, to come away from receiving this wisdom from below, and instead subscribe to a wisdom that descends from above. So do you get that? A wisdom that emerges from below versus a wisdom that descends from above. And he says, this is the wisdom I want you to lean into. This is the wisdom that I want you to take the soil of your heart and open up to receive the seed of God's word so that it can germinate and the very life of Christ can be manifest through your individual personality. Because Jesus ultimately is that wisdom that comes from above, that word of truth by which God begets us to a new life. And so we want to receive that. We want to be open to it. And one of the areas that reveals which of these two kinds of wisdom we are receiving is in the way that we communicate with other people. Especially when those communications tend to involve some kind of a conflict. Or maybe there's something that you're wanting that's a little bit different than something that I'm wanting, or maybe we're both wanting the same thing and there's only not enough of it to go around. Whatever the situation might be, when we're in those times where our communication deals with areas of conflict, we really need to hear what James has to say and receive God's wisdom from above and not that wisdom that emerges from beneath. So how do we communicate with others? Well, if we are subscribing to the wisdom that emerges from below, it's very likely that our communication involves something like this. Maybe we are the kind of person who, when we sense that conflict is going on, we become intimidating. And I think this is especially the case for men, especially those who maybe are big and strong and just sort of have that intimidation factor, is when things start to not go the way I want, I just kind of power up a little bit, stand up a little bit straighter, speak a little bit louder, get a little bit more intense look on my face, and I can just sort of power through this situation and intimidate you, and you'll back down and I'll get my way. But that's really a wisdom of this world. That's a wisdom that comes from below. Maybe we're the opposite, and I don't want to oversell this because guys do it too, but maybe if you're the petite woman, your defense mechanism against the big guy is you just, as soon as something starts to be said that hurts your feelings, you just start crying. Or you just say, you've hurt my feelings, you've offended me in some way. And so the other person is no longer able to communicate freely or speak their mind, because every time they say something that you don't agree with, you just sort of go into weep mode or something like that. And it's not just women, guys can do that too. We just kind of go into this quiet place and somebody asks us what's wrong. We're like, nothing's wrong. So it's just sort of this passive aggressive way that we have of preventing other people from being able to communicate freely into our lives. Or maybe we subscribe to a third sort of this wisdom from below where we don't really listen at all. When the other person is talking, that just is a chance for us to catch our breath and begin to think about what we want to say next as soon as they stop talking. But in reality, there's no communication going on back and forth at all. We're not willing to receive anything that the other person has to say. And so if any of those communication styles ever manifests itself in your conflicts, then I think that what James is going to have to say to us about the wisdom that is from above is going to be a hard thing for you to swallow. So I want to urge you to remember that this wisdom that James is about to drop on us is a wisdom from above. As he said in chapter 1, verse 17, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights. God is a giver of good gifts, and the gift of how to communicate well, how to communicate in a way that accomplishes what God wants communication to accomplish, is a gift. So receive what James is about to say as a precious gift from your good Father. And so here's what he says. The wisdom from above, he says, is this. When it comes to communication, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person, we all need to lean into this, every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Now, as I said a moment ago, this is counterintuitive. This doesn't come natural. In fact, whenever I personally sense that I'm getting into a place with another person where there's some conflict, where there's going to be some disagreement, my natural instinct, that wisdom that comes from below, begins to immediately begin to say, well, wait just a minute. I just want to make sure that you hear what I'm saying. In other words, my natural priority is to speak first. I want you to listen to what I have to say, to speak first. But James says the wisdom from above is exactly the opposite. The wisdom from above says lean in to hear first. In fact, quick to listen. I don't even know exactly how you do that. I know how you are quick to speak, but do you just like quick to listen? Quick to listen. But we need to be, every one of us, quick to listen. And the more controversial, the more dicey, the more tense the situation, the more quick we need to be to listen, to lean in and hear what the other person has to say. So make this our first priority in conversation. Our first concern in communication is to listen to what the other person has to say. Now, one of the things that you'll notice if you're a careful Bible reader is that much of what James has to say, he formulates or reformulates from what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. And you may remember that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gave what we call the golden rule. The golden rule is simply to do unto others as you would have others to do unto you. Now, when you're talking to someone and you're in a disagreement with someone, what do you want for them to do for you? Don't you want them to listen? Don't you want to feel heard and to feel like they understood the point that you were making, that they took the time to listen to the things that you had to say? And isn't it also true that when you feel like they've listened to you, when you feel heard, you're much more inclined to now listen carefully to what it is that they have to say? And so James says, apply the golden rule that Jesus taught and be quick to listen, because you want to be listened to. You want to be heard. So in applying the wisdom of God, do that for others and do it for them first and as quickly as you can. Now, there's a reason that we don't do this, isn't there? And the reason why we don't do this is because I'm right. You know, why do I need to listen to what you have to say when I already have the answer? I know who's right in this situation, so I don't need to. I mean, I'm the one with the wisdom. I'm the one with the insight. I'm the one with the experience. And because I'm right, you need to listen to me. And maybe we do that all the time, maybe especially in positions where we have the authority or we have the power, or if we're the parent, if we're the boss, if we're the elder in the church, or whatever position that is a position of authority or a position of power in the relationship dynamic, we feel like, well, you know, we're the ones who know the things, and you're not, you know, you're speaking to your child and you don't even have full frontal lobe development yet. How could you possibly have anything to say to me that I need to hear? You need to draw from the wisdom of my age and experience. And we know these things and we know that we're right, and yet we just can't get through. We just can't seem to communicate. They just don't seem to get what we have to say. And maybe it's because we've never paused to listen first to what James has to say to us. And that is to be quick to listen to the other person first. And then he says to be slow to speak. So to be quick to hear, but then to be slow to speak. You know, Proverbs 17:27 may be a place that James is thinking of in the Old Testament when he says this. That's where it says, the one who has knowledge uses words with restraint. Again, we think knowledge means I get to speak. Knowledge means I'm just going, you know, I feel like such a hypocrite this morning. I'm up here doing all the talking. The one who has knowledge uses words with restraint. So how can you tell? You're watching two people at a dispute and one of them's just dominating the conversation, just keeps talking. Maybe the default assumption should be that that's the person lacking in knowledge in this situation, because the one who has knowledge uses words with restraint. And whoever has understanding is even-tempered. He's quick to hear, he's slow to speak, and he's slow to anger. And James seems to be appealing to this wisdom when he tells us to be slow, therefore, to speak. And when we speak in these kinds of conversations, we should, after we've heard what the other person has to say, even lean into that further. And maybe when we do speak, it would be a wise thing for us to do is to follow up with what they've said with maybe either a summary. Do I understand you correctly that this is what it is you're saying? And then you don't try to make it as if some absurd thing, but you try to fairly and properly rephrase to them what you think the gist of what they've said to you is. And only when they say, yeah, that's it, you've got it, are you in a position now to be able to speak intelligently in response to that. But I think even before we speak speak our mind, or in response to that, it would be a good thing for us to ask a couple of questions. You've heard their point of view, and it doesn't quite make sense. You don't agree with that. And maybe you even do what I often do in situations like that. You begin to think in your mind if there was this bubble that people could see, and thank goodness there's not. It would say something like, I don't know how anyone could think that. I don't know how anyone could be that dumb. That may be what we're thinking, and if it is what we're thinking, a good question to begin with is to say, I don't understand, because I'm lacking in something, and so I'm going to ask a question. I don't understand how you think that. Could you explain that to me a little bit more so that I can understand? Kids, this is a superpower I'm giving you for your parents. I guarantee you, if they say something about what you're going to have to do or what you can't do, and you don't like it and you don't understand it, if you just said to them, I know that you have a lot of wisdom and understanding, and I don't understand where you're coming from. In fact, I don't understand how anyone could even think that, but I want to know your wisdom. So could you explain that again to me a little more simple and clearly so that I can, if you lean into wanting to hear what they have to say, you might be astonished at how they would react to that. And parents, the same could be true the other way. Because if I don't understand how anyone could think that, what that means is that I need an education. I don't know how other people could think what they think. And so we need to find out. Because I've learned, and you've seen this, most people have a rational thought process for how they come to the conclusions that they come to. And at the end of the day, after you've heard everything that they have to say, you may still not agree with it. You may not have come to the same conclusion, but at least now you will understand how they have come to that conclusion. And if even that doesn't suffice and you're still puzzled by all this, another great question to ask, especially if this is not a person that you know very well, is to say, okay, I think I've got the gist of what you're saying, and I see how you've come there, but maybe it would help me to understand a little bit more if you could just tell me your story. If I could just understand your background and all about you and how you have come to think this way. And we listen to someone's story, and I don't know how many times it's been the case for you, but over and over again, I have found that when I learn where a person has come from and how it is that they have reached the conclusions that they've reached, that again, even though I may not agree with their conclusion, I'm in a whole different place in my relationship to them. And it's all because of subscribing to the wisdom from above that can descend down and make all the difference. And so I lean in and listen and ask these kinds of questions so that when I speak, I'll actually have something worth hearing. Because the longer that you listen, the more that you learn, and the calmer you become. Isn't that the truth? The longer you listen, the more you understand the person, you understand their thought process, and you understand them, the calmer and less angry you get. Isn't that great? And so be quick to listen. And even when you've heard, ask some follow-up questions so that you understand even better until your feelings of anger are under control and perhaps subsided altogether. And so he tells us to do these things, and then he comes on in verse 19 and tells us to be slow to anger. Slow to anger. In other words, maybe we should not even begin to speak until we have our anger under control. Anger, when we're angry, we speak with contempt, or we speak out of defensiveness, or we speak in tones that are hypercritical, and it doesn't further the conversation, it doesn't further understanding or deepen the relationship. And so really, this is a great strategy even for healthy communication. But James is not just trying to give us a technique so that if we calm down, we'll be able to better argue our case. That may all be the case. But James is really after something far more profound, because he says in verse 20 that there's a reason for all this. He says, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. So be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, because the anger of man does not yield, does not produce, does not have the outcome, the righteous outcome that God desires. Now notice the word righteous here. That's a religious sounding word, but it's a simple word that we all understand actually quite well in our day-to-day lives. It just means right. It just means rightness. My rightness is the thing that I'm most concerned about when I'm in a dispute with another person. Again, when I think I'm right, that's my rightness, my righteousness. And I become angry when I feel like my rightness is under assault. The thing that I think is right is not the thing that's winning the day, and to the degree that I see that it is at stake, the anger within me begins to rise up. And I become very concerned with my righteousness and my rightness and the outcome that I'm looking for, which is generally pretty clear. When I'm consumed with my rightness in a dispute with you, I'm concerned about maybe three things. First of all, how right I am. I know I'm right. And number two, I want you to admit that I'm right. Isn't there something of that wisdom that emerges from beneath that we all really get to feeling at this point? That point in an argument when finally you prevail, and maybe out of intimidation, maybe out of passive aggression, maybe out of our logic, for whatever reason, we're able to get the other person to admit it. Okay, you're right. Whew, feels good. And my righteousness, my rightness has been established, it's been maintained, it's been defended, and that's what typically we're after in a conflict, is to show how right we are. So I want to affirm that I'm right. I want you to admit that I'm right. And maybe most of all, if there are other people watching the disagreement, I want everyone to see just how right I am. My righteousness, my self-righteousness is typically from an earthly, sensual, demonic, from a wisdom of this world point of view, is the most important thing to me. And it's why our souls end up fractured, our relations end up marred, and our world is constantly at war, is because we are consumed with our rightness and demonstrating it and proving it, and if possible, humiliating anyone who would find disagreement or fault with it. And James says, yeah, and it does not produce the righteousness that God desires, because the righteousness that God wants is for you to be right with others, not right against them, not right at them, not right over them, but right with them. That's the rightness that God is really after. You know, we really need to receive this wisdom. How many times have you I won the argument, and you lost the relationship? Won the argument, I was right, I proved I was right, they even admitted that I was right, everybody saw just how right I was. Well, where are they? Well, they're gone. She left. Lost my children. Lost my spouse, lost my star employee, lost the things in life that mean the most. But hey, I won the argument, and everybody could see just how right I was. It's a classic example of winning the battle and losing the war. And God's after something much more than our petty sense of self-righteousness. He wants us to be right and reconciled with others. And we can achieve that if we will simply do what James says. And 9 times out of 10, if we'll just be quick to listen, slow to speak, and even slower to anger, we'll find ourselves with outcomes that promote the righteousness that God is looking for, and we won't at that point even care about our petty self-righteousness. In Matthew 5, 23 and 24, again, in the Sermon on the Mount, James is probably thinking of this. And that's where Jesus said, you know, if you have an offering that you're bringing to the altar, and all of a sudden you have this flashback, you remember that your brother has something against you. Well, just set your gift aside, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. In other words, we think that religion is all about getting ourselves reconciled to God in heaven, and it is. But God in heaven is very concerned about you being reconciled horizontally with one another. And so much so that he says, hey, before you get involved in this transaction of this vertical relationship with me, why don't you make your priority first going and getting things right with your brother? And I think James is trying to tell us the same thing. Be concerned with the righteousness that God is concerned with, the righteousness between your brother. And so there are a number of ways that we could make application of this lesson. Hopefully they're obvious, but we need to apply this in our friendships. Every friendship is going to have some conflict. Young people, I tell people this all the time, I've never seen a youth group go through, 5th grade up into middle school, things really start heating up, and through high school without drama. That just never happens. There's going to be drama that comes along. But if in those dramatic situations, in those places where you don't see eye to eye with her or with him or with them, instead of just getting all concerned about being right, proving you're right, and everybody seeing how right you are, make your priority God's priority. The righteousness that he's looking for is for you to be right with the other person. And when we're dealing with our marriages, you'll never in your family win an argument. You cannot, by definition, win an argument in a family, because when you win, you just lost. You lost a lot more than you won. And that's not to say that we don't disagree, that we don't share our disagreements, that we don't talk things through. Absolutely we do. And truth is a priority and a concern, and we want to arrive at that. But the process by which we get there, getting our ego out of the way, concerning ourselves with reconciliation, listening, understanding, communicating without anger, this is pricelessly valuable in the home. And in religious discussions between Christians, I grew up sort of at the end of an era in which there was a debate culture within the church. Debate this week, debate next week, and this brother's going to defend this position. And again, hey, I'm all for the pursuit of truth. That's good and fine. But I also attended many of those debates in which the rancor and the hostility and the insults were just flying back and forth. And everybody in the defense of the truth of the gospel had lost sight of the ethics and the means by which we arrive at that truth that James lays out here before us. And we need to watch that amongst ourselves. And then finally, in the area of evangelism. We always talk about evangelism in terms of how to talk to people about the gospel, how to share Jesus with others. Here's the things that you need to say. Here's the truth that you need to be able to articulate. And I wonder if maybe if we paid attention a little more to what James says, we would begin to prioritize, if to be an effective evangelist, you need to be quick to listen. You need to learn to have an ear to what other people are saying, where they're coming from, and understanding why they think the way that they do. And when you have fully understood that and actually shown to the other person that you care and are willing to listen to them, you'll be in a much better position to talk to them and to share with them the good news about Jesus. Well, finally, I want to conclude this morning by just bringing this back to full circle. Jarrett, in his wonderful lesson last week, showed us from chapter 17 that God's the giver of every good and perfect gift. And that includes this wisdom that comes down to us. And he talked about how Jesus, who is called there the word of truth, the word of truth is the best gift that God ever gave that came down to us. And he's described there as the word of truth. But you ever thought about the fact that when he who was the Word made flesh, when God's Son came into this world, the Word of truth came into this world, he came into the world as a baby who couldn't say a word, who couldn't speak a word. And in fact, for 30 years, we don't know anything that he said except for one brief situation in which his parents had found him at the temple asking questions of the priests and the teachers at the temple. It's like for 30 years, Jesus came into this world and didn't have a whole lot to say, but he had a whole lot to listen. And he observed people, and he saw his fellow countrymen's pain and their sorrows and their funerals and their oppression under their Roman overlords. And all the things that they were dealing with and the troubles that they had and the opinions that they had and the attitudes that they had, he observed all those things so carefully that after 30 years, when he finally opened his mouth to begin his public teaching ministry, they said, "No man ever spoke like this man." And he's not like these other religious teachers who are just like, man, they're just pounding their views and their thoughts and their opinions, but he speaks with a different kind of authority altogether, an earned authority. An authority from heaven, a different kind of wisdom that descends from above. And they listened and hung on every word that he said. And I think that's amazing because, Jesus could have come into the world and said, "Hey, I'm here to prove a point, and I want to show you how right I am." And he was right about everything. But I'm thankful that he didn't come to just prove how right he was and how wrong we are. That would have taken him all of 30 seconds to show how right he was and how wrong I am. But he didn't come to do that. He came instead to reconcile man to God and man to man. And when we receive his wisdom, the word of truth that begets within us a new heart, we can learn to communicate with one another in a way that is utterly different from anything that this world knows. And we'll be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And in doing so, accomplish the righteousness that God desires. If we can help you this morning in your journey to come to know Christ, to put him on in baptism, or if there's a need that you have for the prayers of the brothers and sisters here at the congregation, we'd be happy to help you any way that we can. We encourage you to come while we stand and while we sing.